Cześć. That's my Polish. I've learned a word. Hi, I'm Dele. I'm from IBM. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm with Interactive Experience. Has anyone here heard of IBM's Interactive Experience? No one. Wow, shocking. So IBM Interactive Experience is the largest digital marketing agency in the world by volume, by output, by throughput. So we're sort of the spearhead, the digital transformation of the IBM organization, and do massive amounts of work in terms of helping clients redefine how to operate in this digital age. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been a founder of a startup for personal data management, helping people use personal data to earn rewards and share data with brands in a safe and protected manner. I'm also a writer. I'm a best-selling author on the intersection of digital media with society and culture. And I'm a big advocate of universal digital rights as an extension of human rights. And I set up an NGO called the Internet Foundation, which campaigns for this. So this issue of regulation is very central to me personally and professionally. So let's go to this data thing and let's talk about regulation in the digital space and data specifically. And why is it important and why do we have it and what's it all heading? So in 2004, Peter Thiel asked a young upcoming entrepreneur, Mark Zuckerberg, why he thought his new social network, the Facebook, was not incrementally, but 10 times more valuable and more important than all the previous social networks, Bebo, MySpace, Friends, etc. Zuckerberg replied that Facebook is the only social network that makes sure, that maintains that you have to declare your identity. It turns out that Zuckerberg was right. Personal data is worth trillions. In fact, this ability to anchor personal data to real identities is the crux of Facebook's value. The World Economic Forum has estimated that personal data will be worth over €1 trillion in Europe alone by 2020. Just repeat that, €1 trillion in Europe alone by 2020. But there's a lot more to it than just that. In fact, I believe that data, so McKinsey released a statistic this year, and they showed that the movement of data around the planet now generates more money, more revenue than the movement of physical goods. So let's just think about that for a second. Movement of data generates more value, more money, more revenue than the movement of physical goods. What this really symbolizes is the end of the industrial era, the birth of the knowledge era. This is really the milestone point, at the point where data is more valuable than products. And I think this is a really important context in which to look at personal data, and regulation. You know, a lot of the digital companies understand this. Companies like Uber understand that the ability to produce products is always going to be subject to commoditization forces. Even the great Apple with the iPhone is now facing commoditization pressures of the declining price of smartphones. So the value really now lies in being able to build deep, loyal relationships with customers, to be able to identify moments in a customer journey where you can inflect experiences that deliver value to people. That's how profit is generated in this new paradigm. And this becomes really critical in the fintech, insurtech space, because now you're getting these players who have amassed massive amounts of data where they're able to understand consumer behavior, the opportunities for these inflection points, to innovate around them, to develop new hyper-granular risk models that outperform traditional ones, and therefore steal a march in this space. So you can see the onslaught, the inevitability of financial services from the digital giants that serve us today is clear. In fact, there's very much an arms race that's going on at the moment between the big behemoths. around gathering as much data as possible to be able to personalize these services and to be able to identify these opportunities for revenue generation by being able to service people's needs more effectively, more compellingly than the competition. And I'm sure you've all heard this phrase, data is the new oil, data is the oil of the 21st century. I would go so far as to say not only is it the new oil, it is also the currency. It is the means through which value is exchanged in the 21st century. But it's not all happy days. Has anybody heard this phrase? If you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you are the product being sold. So Zuckerberg got into a lot of trouble for saying this once. He wasn't the first person to say it. It's a bit of a philosophy that's in Silicon Valley in many regards. And this really does throw up a lot of really profound issues. If we don't own our data, if we don't own our identity, then who does? And on what basis is this being sold? On what basis is this being transferred or moved across over? And of course, as a result, regulators have had now to step into the play. How many people here are familiar with the GDPR? Okay, what's that? 7, 8%? They say that GDPR may be the most important legislation of our generation. GDPR, you need to find out about it if you don't know about it, because GDPR is basically the General Data Protection Regulation coming from Europe. The European Union has basically put this policy in place. There will be fines. It comes into law in 2018. Companies it's the new data protection legislation, and companies that are in infraction will be charged up to 4% of global revenues or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. So this is a seismic shift in the way that the market is operating. And the important thing to understand about GDPR and the important thing to understand about this regulation is that the European Union is very much approaching this from a human rights perspective. They've really come at GDPR from the basis of protecting European human rights. And this is in line with what lots of organizations like the Internet Foundation have been calling for many years. An extension of human rights into the digital domain. A framework through which companies can use personal data in a responsible and sustainable manner. And sustainability is really a key word here. So I like this. I'm a bit of a petrol head and a bit of a car nut. But this car is particularly important. This is the AC Cobra. Now, in many ways, you can argue the internet's a bit like the early birth of the automotive industry. The car really liberated us. It did a massive amount of transformation for the common man. We could, where we were bound by horse and carriages and distances that before, we were suddenly liberated to be able to go over mass distances with low maintenance, etc., etc., etc. The role of the automotive in the 20th century of liberating and freeing and enabling us as people cannot be underestimated. But the Cobra is really interesting because it's associated with the arrival of the speed limit in the UK. The legend is that AC team were using it to do tests along the M1 at 186 miles per hour. And eventually the government was like, okay, look, this is all great, and we've got these cars are great, but we need to put a framework in place so that we can use these tools in a way that is safe, so that people don't get hurt, so that we are all protected. And that, in many senses, is what is really needed in the internet space now. We need a framework, we need a code, we need a model whereby we can use the internet in a safe way, where we're all protected. I think everybody's starting to become aware of the dangers in this space, the hacking reports that we hear on a daily basis, identity theft, etc., etc., etc. So, not to mention things like exposure to children or whatnot. So, what the clean data framework is that. It's a set of rules, it's a set of guiding principles around how we can use the internet, how we can use personal data specifically in a responsible and sustainable manner. It really kind of comes down to 3 core principles, the first of which is privacy. Second of which is ownership, and this is a really important one. Our data is our property, and as such, it should be protected by property rights in that regards. And then consent. Really and truly, informed consent, and this is a pinnacle of the GDPR regulation, that informed consent, explicit consent, is essential for the use of personal data going forward. So, if you want a clearer view of the future, you really need to clean your data. But there's massive value that's associated with that. And if data truly is the oil of the 21st century, then the clean data framework is really analogous to clean energy. And in many ways, where we are today in the privacy, personalization, personal data evolution curve is very similar to where energy was 15, 20 years ago. There's a big debate as to whether this was an important issue, but now it's accepted. You cannot operate as a company without starting to make moves towards having a zero carbon footprint, to having zero emissions, to being environmentally friendly. And from a sustainability issue, the use of personal data in a responsible manner is a key sustainable issue. The practices of the 20th century and the early 21st century that have been happening around personal data are not sustainable. They cannot continue. And this is why regulations have stepped in. But the key thing here is that this represents a new opportunity to build trusted engagement with consumers. 97% of consumers don't trust brands with their data. That's pretty startling when you really kind of unpack it. So this ability to actually use this new framework that's being forced in by regulation and compliance, but is also being demanded by culture, represents a new basis from which we can start to build trusted relationships with consumers. And those trusted relationships will enable us to innovate and create in a new way. So I think there's often quite a big debate that, well, you've got innovation on one hand and regulation on the other. Well, actually, I disagree. I don't think they're mutually incompatible. And in fact, privacy is really the basis around which we can do the best innovations going forward. Thank you.